Hi, and welcome to another Deck Tech with RigelB. My name is Rigel, and today I'm going to be talking with you about a deck called Naya Sky, or Naya Tokens. Okay, so let me just real quickly give you an overview about what this deck is trying to do. As you can see from the main deck here, the deck is predominantly creatures. We got 31 creatures, 22 land, and 7 other cards. And so what this deck is trying to do, your game plan for victory is deploying creatures and attacking with them. And we're trying to do that as quickly as possible. As you can see from this low curve down here, 1s, 2s, and 3s, we're trying to deploy the creatures to the board as quickly as possible and attack with them. That being said, I would not describe this deck as an aggro deck. While we're trying to develop to the board really quickly, all of the creatures that we're putting out there, or the majority of the creatures that we're putting out there, are pretty small and aren't going to do a lot of damage. So with that in mind, we're not going to be capable of throwing down some creatures, attacking with them, and winning on like turn 4 or 5 just on the back of those creatures. This is a deck that's much more designed for going into the mid game. I would describe it as a mid-range deck, and you're really not going to be able to win until you've reached that mid game and have really been able to overwhelm your opponent with card advantage and flooding the board with creatures so that you have a massive board, and then also taking to the skies, having flyers to attack with. So yeah, that's our general game plan. I'd like to start out by discussing some of the cards that really make this deck tick. There's 4 cards in the deck that we're really trying to maximize the potential of, and those 4 cards have sort of influenced how the rest of the deck is built. Those 4 cards are Edgewall Innkeeper, Clarion Spirit, Toski, and Showdown of the Scalds. And so just to discuss how each of those has influenced how the rest of the deck is built, I'll go through them one by one. Edgewall Innkeeper. In order to maximize the potential of this card, we want to have as many adventure cards in our deck as possible. That's how we're going to get the most card advantage. So that means that a lot of these spells have to be adventures. So we have Lovestruck Beast, Bone Crusher Giant, Shepherd of the Flock, Giant Killer, and Fairy Guide Mother. So between those, we have 13 adventure creatures, which makes good use out of the Edgewall Innkeeper to give us a source of card advantage. The next card is Clarion Spirit. For this card, to maximize its potential, you want to have both cheap cards so that you can play 2 spells in the same turn, as well as having enough cards to keep on casting multiple spells on several turns into the game, as opposed to just casting 2 spells in a turn and then being out of cards in your hand. To maximize the potential of Clarion Spirit, it actually fits really well with this adventure package, because each of these adventure creatures represents 2 spells in 1 card. So by having this adventure package, we're actually going to be able to double spell much more frequently after we've played this Clarion Spirit. We won't run out of spells as easily. In addition to that, we have other sources of card advantage like Edgewall Innkeeper, Toski, and Showdown of the Scalds, which are all going to let us keep on double spelling and making the most potential out of Clarion Spirit. The next card, Toski, Bearer of Secrets. To maximize the potential of this card, you really want to have as many creatures on the battlefield as possible, because for this card, every single creature that deals damage to the opponent, you draw a card. So if you can swarm the board with as many creatures as possible, then you're going to draw more cards off of Toski by attacking with them. As opposed to just having a few concentrated large creatures, you're not going to be able to necessarily get through with them. And so this really benefits flooding the board. The other thing that it benefits is having evasive creatures, flying creatures. If you have flying creatures, they're going to be able to connect with the opponent much more frequently. So in that sense, it combos really well with Clarion Spirit, which has the ability to both go wide as well as create flyers. Okay, and the next card, Showdown of the Scalds. To maximize the potential of Showdown of the Scalds, again, you want to have really cheap cards in your deck, because when you play this, you only have the turn that you've played it and the next turn to be able to play as many of those 4 cards that you exile as possible. And so the cheaper those cards are, the more likely it is you're going to be able to play all of them. And so that really dictates wanting to have a very low curve, as was something we already wanted for Clarion Spirit as well. And then also maximizing the potential of this card, chapters 2 and 3, you put +1/+1 counters on creatures. So to maximize the potential of this card, you want to have creatures on the battlefield, which this deck is already, that's the main game plan. We want to have creatures out there, and so we're going to get the most potential. We're going to really maximize the value of this card. So I've talked a little bit about wanting to have our curve as low as possible for both Clarion Spirit as well as Showdown of the Scalds. We want to have cheap spells. So just to look at our curve real quickly, and I'm actually going to move some of these adventure cards around to where they can be played at their cheapest. All the adventure cards have 2 different modes, and so if I move them to be where they are when you play them as cheaply as possible, the curve now looks a lot more like this. We have a huge number of 1-drops as well as 2-drops, and not much beyond that. This very tight low curve is what really maximizes those 2 cards that we talked about. We're really going to be able to play all the spells that we exile with Showdown on Scalds, as well as double spell for Clarion Spirit whenever we have the cards to cast. So that's how those are all playing together. Let's go ahead and discuss each of the cards individually. See how they impact the deck. Okay, so we talked about these 2 top end cards already, and how much card advantage they're going to give us in this deck. These 2 cards combined with Edgewall Innkeeper. Those are the reasons why we can go into the late game with our pseudo aggressive deck and actually thrive there. We have a lot of sources of card advantage between those 12 cards in the deck. And you'll notice that I'm playing the full 4 Toski, Bearer of the Secrets, even though it's a legendary creature. It's just because this card is so powerful in this deck. Basically, a lot of times you don't want multiple copies of legendary creatures, because if you get 2 in your hand and you can only play one of them, that's card disadvantage. But with this deck, having a Toski on the battlefield gives you so much extra card advantage that you can afford to every now and then draw an extra Toski that you can't play. Just having that first one makes up for that disadvantage. And you really want to maximize your potential of having that first one. So I put the full 4 Toski in the main deck. Okay, so the cards, here we have Lovestruck Beast. This adventure creature is really useful in this deck, as it contributes to the going wide plan. You get to create 2 different creatures with it, but also the 5/5 of the Lovestruck Beast really is effective in all of your matchups. When you're playing against other aggressive decks, a 5/5 body out there is really a good brick wall. Like if you're playing against mono red, a 5/5 is just really difficult for them to deal with and can hold back the opposing offense. And so that'll help you get to your late game, where you can make use of your card advantage engines that we've already talked about. Conversely, against decks that aren't aggressive but are more controlling, that say they're control decks, again, the Lovestruck Beast is really effective, because that 5/5 body can apply a lot more pressure than anything else in the deck. It's going to be taking big chunks out of their life total and allow you to win faster in those control matchups, which is the goal against those control matchups. Okay, so Bone Crusher Giant. Again, this card, you'll notice that I'm only playing 2 of them. It's because of their ineffectiveness in the control matchups where your opponent doesn't have creatures. If you can't get this first half to kill a creature, the card is really less impactful on the game. A 3 mana 4/3 is not really what you want in those control matchups. Because starting turn 4, they might just wrath your board away, or it might just die to a card that is cheaper than 3 mana itself. So that's really not the type of card you're looking for in the control matchups. That being said, it's very useful in the against the more aggressive matchups where they have impactful creatures that you want to kill. Say you're playing against another adventure deck, you really want to be able to kill this Edgewall Innkeeper so they can't go to town with that. So that's where this card is going to shine, where you can kill a creature and then also play the 4/3 body. Also against, say, mono red, they have several low drops that you're trying to. It's really useful to be able to kill those because it keeps them off of Embercleave. The fewer creatures they have on the board, the less likely they are going to be able to put in an Embercleave, which is the real main threat playing in that matchup. You want to be able to avoid getting hit by Embercleave as much as possible. Okay, so the Clarion Spirit and Edgewall Innkeeper we already talked about. Giant Killer, part of this adventure package again. There's a lot of creatures in the format that it can kill with the destroy target creature with power 4 or greater. So that makes it really useful. The reason that there's 4 of these and only 2 of these, when they're both situational removal, where if you can't get value out of the first half, like, it's not a great card. The reason that Giant Killer has 4 and Bone Crusher Giant only has 2 is that Giant Killer is 1 mana. So it contributes to that game plan that we were talking about with Showdown on the Scalds and Clarion Spirit, of being able to cast as many of our spells as possible. The fact that the creature half of it is just 1 mana means that we're going to be able to make use of it even if the first half of it isn't too useful. Fairy Guide Mother, you'll notice that I only have 1 of these in there, but I do think that it's a valuable card to have in the deck when you're just trying to determine your last couple cards that make the cut. The reason being is that both halves are useful and cheap, and play into our game plan. So again, it's an adventure card. We get 2 spells out of 1 card. Both halves of the spell are cheap. The creature half is a 1/1 flyer, which again plays well with Toski because it has evasion. It's 1 mana, which plays well with Clarion Spirit and Showdown of Scalds. And then the other half of it, the +2/+1 and gains flying, that can be really useful when you just want to get a hit through with, say, Lovestruck Beast. Casting it there, you can get in for an easy 7 damage. Or you may just use it on any ground creature when you have a Toski out and you want to get an extra hit in and draw extra cards. Shepherd of the Flock. This card is useful for a lot of different card advantage engines. The half of it where you return a permanent to your hand, you can use it on your other adventure cards to be able to keep on casting spells and keep on getting value out of those adventure cards. Or you could end up using it on Showdown on the Scalds, which will give you even more card advantage. So the way this works, when you're using it on Showdown on the Scalds to bring the Showdown on the Scalds back and get more cards out of it, you want to make sure that you have a stop set in your own main phase, and before your turn starts, you have to have that stop set. And you want to have it for that 3rd turn that you have this in play, when the 3rd chapter is going to trigger. If you have that stop set in your main phase, then you'll be able to respond to the trigger of the Showdown on the Scalds. And so you'll get that last effect where you get to put +1/+1 counters on your creatures that turn. But in response to that ability resolving, you use Shepherd of the Flock to return it to your hand. And so the Shepherd of the Flock being cast won't trigger that ability itself, but that's just the price you have to pay to get it back in your hand and get the advantage. You have to do it before this third chapter resolves, because then the showdown will go away and you can't bring it back. Okay, so those are all the adventure creatures. Another really important card in the deck, this Jaspera Sentinel. This Jaspera Sentinel, while it doesn't look like much, you've probably seen it in draft and passed it by, as it's not a very good card. But it actually plays very, very effectively in this deck. It contributes to some of your most powerful starts. I'll give you an example of one of your most powerful starts that you can have. If you cast Jaspera Sentinel turn 1, turn 2, you cast Clarion Spirit, and then you tap both of those creatures to give you another mana, and you play a 1-drop off of that. And then you'll be able to trigger the Clarion Spirit right away. And so already on turn 2, you're going to have 4 creatures on the battlefield. That's one of your most explosive starts that you can have, as it really is the game plan of this deck to go wide like that and get value out of Toski and just flood the board. So that's a really important card in helping to ramp out your deployment to the board. So the only other cards that I haven't talked about so far are Kabira Takedown and Tangled Florahedron. Both of these are spell lands. As you'll notice, you can play them as either a land or a spell. And so that's really effective in controlling the number of lands that you have in your deck. If you look over here at our mana base, we have 22 lands over here. And so the 22 lands over here means that when we want to play these as spells, we can keep our land count down to avoid flooding out by just drawing tons of lands. With only 22 in our deck, it's not going to happen too frequently. But conversely, it will help us from getting mana screwed as well, because when we want to, we have another 5 lands over here, which brings our land total up to 27. So that flexibility in our land count really smooths out our ability to control whether we're going to get mana screwed or flooded. It makes our land drops much more smooth. And with having up to 27 lands, we can keep making land drops even later into the game, which can be helpful because of how much card advantage we actually generate. We want to keep on making land drops and have the ability to spend as much mana as possible later on in the game like that. Okay, so talking about our mana base, the mana base is actually one of the trickiest elements of the deck, because the reason is you frequently want to have multiple colored lands in each of the different colors. And the reason for this is that all your cards are so cheap and you're trying to cast multiple of them in one turn. It frequently means that you're going to be casting 2 spells of the same color in one turn. So even though we don't have anything here that's double mana casting cost, we are frequently trying to make use of the multiple sources of the same color in a turn. And so to take a look at what we've got over here, we have all 12 of the pathways, and then some forests, mountains, plains, as well as the 4 fabled passage. So what this adds up to giving us over here, we have 15 total green sources, and then if you count the Tangled Florahedron, that brings us up to 17. We have 15 total white sources, but then if we 14 total white sources. Then if we add the Kabira Takedown, that brings us up to 17 again. And then we have 13 total red sources, which red is our least represented color in the deck. whereas all the cards that we're going to be playing as early as possible, turn 1, we're really looking to have these green cards played turn 1. So that's why you'll see the most color green represented. But then the rest of the deck is mostly white. And so the next most represented is white. And again, like I said, later on, but even starting by like turn 3 or 4, you're trying to cast multiple spells. And so the reason that causes so many tricks with our deck and mana base is that none of our lands actually produce multiple colors of mana. Each one of these pathways, when we play it, we have to choose a color that we're going to play it on. And what color we choose in those early turns can really influence our capabilities starting turn 3 and 4 and 5 of which colors we're going to be able to cast multiple spells in. And so those early decisions are actually really impactful, not even that far into the game as far as like what we're capable of casting from our hand and being able to double spell. So those decisions, you really have to pay attention when you're deploying your mana base. The last card we've got here is Gigantha. Gigantha's here because, as you'll notice, it's free. There's no cards that we really wanted to play that we couldn't because we have this companion. So having a free companion is really valuable. It just gives you another card to, again, help prevent from flooding. It gives you another access to another card. Okay, so that's basically the main deck and how it's going to play out. We're really just developing the board as quickly as possible, and then we have a lot of staying power between our card advantage engines that we have. And so once we get that card advantage going, we just flood the board, and once we're overwhelming the board, we're really able to finish off our opponent. So let's quickly discuss the sideboard and the choices that we have over here. I'll just start from the top. We have Tormod's Crypt. This card is in here mostly for cycling right now. That's the most prevalent deck where it's going to be relevant. And the way that it plays out against cycling is you really want to have this out on the battlefield and leave it out there to negate a Zenith Flare. If they cast the Zenith Flare and then in response you sack this to exile their graveyard, it's going to reduce the damage that Zenith Flare does significantly. Probably to 0, but after you've activated your Tormod's Crypt, they could cycle some cards then if they have some more mana left over. So that's going to negate their Zenith Flares. Another place where it could be relevant is playing against Rakdos. And there's various different Rakdos builds right now. But all of the different Rakdos builds make some use of their graveyard with cards like Kroxa or Woe Strider or Oxyvagonus. Various different ways that they get card advantage out of their graveyard. So having these crypts to exile the graveyard can be effective there. Redcap Melee. This is mostly there just for mono red. It does have usefulness elsewhere. For instance, it could be useful killing Goldspan Dragon. So if you're playing against, say, an adventure deck that has Goldspan Dragon as well as some other red creatures, you'll want to bring this in there as well. But its greatest usefulness is just against the mono red deck. As far as bringing it in for Goldspan Dragon decks, while I think it is useful to bring it in, I wouldn't bring it in against the Naya Fury deck, where a lot of the times the sequence of their turns goes that they're going to play turn 4 Showdown of the Scalds, and then turn 5 they're going to play a Goldspan Dragon and attack with it. You'd like to be able to use this Redcap Melee to kill their Goldspan Dragon, but against that Naya Fury deck, if they've gone Showdown of the Scalds into Goldspan Dragon, then when you try to target their Goldspan Dragon with Redcap Melee, all they have to do is cast any instant, and they're going to have a Showdown on the Scalds trigger to put a +1/+1 counter on their Goldspan Dragon, which really makes the Redcap Melee a much less effective card in that matchup. So in that matchup, particularly, something like Run Afoul is going to be much more effective. So that's why this Run Afoul is in the sideboard. it's mainly there just for Naya Fury. It's going to be a much more effective answer to the Goldspan Dragon in that matchup. Because that's going to be the only flyer that they have on the board. So you'll be able to kill it without targeting it with some damage-based removal. And they won't be able to protect it with a Sageri Shelter either. So that's why that's there. Drannith Magistrate. So this card, it's going to be most effective against basically decks like this one, where you have adventure cards that you're trying to cast from exile, as well as the Showdown on the Scalds, which gives you cards to cast from exile. So any deck that has both Showdown on the Scalds and adventure creatures, you're definitely going to want all these Drannith Magistrates in there. If they only have one or the other, say they had adventure cards but not Showdown on the Scalds, you may not want the full amount of these, as it's just not as effective if you don't have as many cards that you're impacting. And you're not completely negating those adventure cards either. They still get to play the creature half of them, or the whatever the side is that doesn't exile them on adventure. And again, if you're playing against a deck that has Showdown on the Scalds but not adventure creatures, again, you may not want to bring in these as many of these Drannith Magistrates, as you're only shutting down one card, so you'll not bring in the full 3 necessarily. Redain, God of the Worthy. This card's in there entirely for your control matchups, or mostly for your control matchups. You're really trying to stop their ability to wrath your board on turn 4 or turn 5, depending on whether they're using Extinction Events or Shadow's Verdict or Doomscar or Shattered the Sky. Playing a Redain is going to slow down each of those cards significantly. So you're bringing those in your control matchups. It's also going to shut down in addition to the Wraths and various other expensive spells, it's important to shut down Sultai Ultimatum. The Ultimatum is when you have a Redain out there, it's going to cast 13 mana, because the Ultimatum itself is going to cost 9 mana, and then each of the 2 cards that they want to cast off of it, unless they chose really cheap cards, are also going to cast 2 extra mana. So that's 13 mana. So they really can't cast their Ultimatum with a Redain on the battlefield. And to that, with that in mind, when you're playing in that matchup, a lot of times you're going to want to try and sequence your turns so that you make sure you have a Redain out there as soon as they can cast their Ultimatum. It's almost more important to protect yourself against their Ultimatum than it is to protect yourself against their Wraths. The Wraths you can actually build back from fairly quickly with your various sources of card advantage. But if they land an Ultimatum, it's going to close the game in their favor very quickly. And so you really want to be able to prevent them from landing an Ultimatum. To that effect, I usually also bring in Drannith Magistrate in that matchup. Having a Magistrate out there will also shut down the Ultimatum. And again, you're trying to sequence it so that you're not deploying this to the board early when it's going to get swept away with one of their Wraths. You're trying to wait and deploy this, say, right before they're going to get to 7 mana, so that even if they have a way to deal with it, they're going to have to deal with it first and not be able to Ultimatum on that turn. So it provides a little road bump. Even if they can deal with it, it'll slow down their Ultimatum by a full turn at least. So yeah, really think about your sequencing with those 2 cards in that matchup. Archon of Absolution. This card's here mostly for mono white, but I do think it has some usefulness in various decks that go wide. Say this one, for instance, if you're playing in the mirror match, I usually bring that in, as well as against Jeskai Cycling, where they can go wide with Valiant Rescuer and Improbable Alliance. I'll go ahead and bring that in in those matchups as well. But you'll notice there's only one. It's because mono white aggro has sort of fallen off and isn't as popular as it has been. As well as it being a pretty favorable matchup for you already anyways. So you could conceivably think about removing that if you want to find something else to go into the sideboard. Felidar Retreat. This card's here almost entirely for the mirror. It's a very effective card in the mirror match. When you're playing against the mirror match, both sides are going to be flooding the board and not really interacting with each other too much. You'll notice that we only have some Bone Crusher Giants and Giant Killers. So there's not a lot of preventing the opponent's game plan. So if you're both flooding the board, this is a way to really get advantage by boosting the size of your creatures and giving them vigilance so that you can swing back and still have your swing out and still have your creatures on defense. Especially, you know, with Clarion Spirit where you're getting a bunch of 1/1 flying tokens. If you can start growing your flying tokens and they can't, that's going to close the game very quickly. So that's why that's there. You can also consider bringing it in various different control matchups. As in control matchups, a lot of times, first several turns, you're deploying creatures to the board. When you get to turn 4, you may not want to keep deploying creatures to the board when you know that they might just wrath your board on the next turn. And so this is a way to deploy a threat to the board and improve your position without contributing and overextending into the wrath. It'll still represent possible damage that you can do on the future turns without deploying more creatures to the board. So then, you know, that's how that plays out. I would be a little bit careful siding in the Felidar Retreat too aggressively because you already have a bunch of 4-mana cards that are very effective in those control matchups. Both of these Showdown Scalds and Toski are effective there. And so if you're bringing in both of these Felidar Retreat, your curve's getting a little bit higher. And in the control matchups, we are trying to really play the aggressive side of things. We're trying to kill them as quickly as possible. And so you don't want to raise your curve too much, but it still plays effectively there. Okay, so as far as the sideboard goes, this is how I have it built right now. There's some other ideas you can try out. For one, you could try out Klothys. If Klothys is a much more effective card against the Rakdos matchups than Tormod's Crypt is. If you land a Klothys again in that matchup, it's very difficult for them to win. Whereas if you land a Tormod's Crypt, they can still win through that pretty effectively. So that's an idea, but it's much worse against the Jeskai Cycling. Tormod's Crypt is much better there. Yeah, Glass Casket and Red Cap melee. If your metagame's very aggro, you might want to have a little bit more of that. But the deck's actually pretty effective in those matchups already, just by the ability to flood the board. Another idea, instead of these Drannith Magistrates and Redanes, or in addition to, if Sultai Ultimatum's a real problem, Roiling Vortex is another card that you can consider for your sideboard. It's very effective against the Sultai Ultimatum, as if they try and cast Sultai Ultimatum with the Roiling Vortex out there, they're going to be taking 10 damage right away. So a lot of times you'll get their life total to a situation where they can't even cast it if you have a Roiling Vortex out there. So that's another card you could consider trying in the sideboard. This is how I have it built right now. And overall, I feel like the deck has played out very well, and it's very effective in our current metagame. And it's just really effective both against aggro decks and control decks because of its ability to deploy so quickly to the board, but also have a lot of card advantage in these 12 cards for staying power later into the game. So that's basically how the deck works. I've had a lot of success with it and a lot of fun with it, and I hope you give it a try sometime. All right, see you next time.